Part 84. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 831. Ha ha ha, if you have anything else to say now, just say it all. I'm afraid, it will be too late for you to say it in a while. The corner of Ling Yun's mouth only evoked a slight sneer, and then he spoke leisurely, with a completely gloomy look on his face. At this moment, Lin Yu was standing outside the city, looking at the overwhelming blood in the city. A bit of confusion flashed across his somewhat ugly face. It's strange, the strong men in the city are a bit scary, and I don't know why. The sword of the Emperor in my hand is actually reminding me that the city is very dangerous. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he gently wiped the imperial sword in his hand. He just rubbed his chin so gently, and then a faint sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. After Feng Ling heard what Lin Yu said, her entire face was filled with disbelief, and the look she looked at Lin Yu was filled with confusion. How is it possible? The sword of the Emperor is actually reminding you of the danger. Then those guys in the city are really a bit scary. How about we just wait and see what happens now? After Lin Yu heard Feng Ling say this, he gently rubbed his chin, then pondered for a moment, and then shook his head. It still doesn't work. Some things really can't be postponed. Let's do this. I'll go to the city to see what's going on in a while, and then I'll see what happens next. Lin Yu turned his head and glanced at Feng Ling, and then a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. After Feng Ling heard what Lin Yu said, she couldn't help but nodded gently, then turned her head, glanced at Lin Yu, and spoke softly. Be careful, I always feel that there may be some danger in this. Lin Yu just rolled his eyes, and then smiled loudly. Ha ha ha, it doesn't matter. As the saying goes, this soldier will block the water and cover up the soil. No matter what he does next, I'm not afraid anyway. After Feng Ling heard what Lin Yu said, she was not angry at the time. She rolled her eyes at Lin Yu fiercely, and then waved her fist at Lin Yu. She was not angry. He said in a deep voice to his side. Anyway, it's all up to you, I don't care. At this time, Feng Ling said helplessly, and then shook her head. Waiting for the next second, Lin Yu suddenly flew forward and took a step forward, and then released that fierce murderous aura. An air of indifference instantly rose to the sky, and then he saw Lin Yu disappear in front of him. Feng Ling is naturally a smart woman. She certainly understands that she may not be able to participate in the battle in the city, so she naturally does not want to be a burden to Lin Yu. At this moment, after Qin Qiu exploded into a ball of blood mist. Seeing this scene, the 18 butcher's face suddenly turned ugly, and then he laughed loudly, and then released his momentum without reservation. Ha ha ha, it doesn't matter, anyway, the matter has come to this, life and death are unpredictable, wealth and wealth are determined by the heart. Today I really don't believe it, and I won't do anything to you. The 18 butchers also suddenly took a step forward, and then immediately released their momentum, almost completely releasing a surging murderous intent at that moment. Almost at that moment, they just returned to the box. In 1 second, the surging energy soared into the sky, directly above the 9 heavens, and fell below the 9 earths. These 18 butchers released the indifferent blood energy in themselves without reservation. Then, he smelled a faint smell of blood around him, and it began to spread. That strong energy arose spontaneously, forcing everyone to retreat crazily towards the back one after another. At this moment, Lin Yu also rushed over slowly. At this time, Lin Yu's expression flashed a bit of gloom after seeing this scene. The next second, he just half closed his eyes. Interesting, but I don't know where that guy Qin Qiu has gone. Lin Yu hid in the darkness and watched everything happening quietly, but had no intention of taking action. The 18 butchers completely released the blood energy around them, and then in the next second, they saw the blood energy around them begin to condense little by little around the 18 butchers. Immediately afterwards, I saw an ethereal aura, falling from the 9 heavens to the 9 earths, forcing everyone to fly back so suddenly at that moment and retreat one after another. The 18 butcher laughed loudly, as if he was completely crazy, and there was a clear look of contempt in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. Ha ha ha, I still don't believe it today. I am still a half-step god king. Even if I am immortal today, I will be severely injured. The blood energy around the 18 butchers condensed into the appearance of a butcher in the void in that moment. The man in the void pushed his palm downwards like this crazily. That palm carried a mighty force, and had the courage that could not be stopped by 10,000 men. It stretched out and spread quietly. After seeing that palm, all the people looked at each other in surprise. Those people's eyes were full of surprise, and the eyes looking at the 18 butchers were full of disbelief. Those people could not believe the strength of the 18 butchers at all. Now it has reached such a terrifying level. At this time, the 18 butchers only had a faint cold smile on their lips. Even Ling Yun noticed that the figure in the void seemed to be a threat to him. Ling Yun's face was a little gloomy, and then he couldn't help but cursed inwardly. Damn it, it deserves to be killed. However, at this time, Ling Yun, even though he said this, still combined the blood and energy around him into one. At this moment, the Lord of Guling City was standing aside, and after seeing this scene, a faint smile suddenly appeared on the corner of his mouth. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 832. Ha ha ha, Ling Yun, I wonder if you won't die this time. Ling Yun's face condensed, and his expression could not help but become cold, and then he heard him say such a cold voice. Ha ha ha, it's not that easy for you to kill me. Feel free to come here today. I want to see how powerful you are. At this time, Ling Yun launched the 9,999 palms in front of him in an instant. These 9,999 palms were twisted directly into one palm. The next second, he swung heavily towards the butcher's shadow in the void. The faces of the 18 butchers froze after seeing this scene, and their expressions became even colder. At this time, the 18 butcher looked at the palm pushed out by Ling Yun with a slightly ugly expression. The 18 butcher suddenly flew back and retreated for a long time before he managed to regain his balance, and then an angry roar was heard from his mouth. It's not enough, it's not enough. If that's the case, I'm willing to use my blood to spread all over the world. After the 18 butchers finished speaking, they gave a cold shout, then flew forward towards the front, suddenly rushing straight away, but in just a moment, they were already gone. Soaring above the 9 heavens and landing below the 9 earths, a sense of indifference completely spread from the chest. That strong aura carries the lifelong skills of these 18 butchers, and that aura has a somewhat desolate feel. The 18 butchers used their last breath and shouted angrily, "Who is willing to help me?" As soon as the 18 butcher finished speaking, he heard sounds one after another, completely coming from the void. "I'm willing to help." At this moment, he saw a young man covered in blood, rushing up like this. The black and white evil spirits are willing to help. Chen Pianan, willing to help. Nanchin Jeju, willing to help. Just like this, the voices spread quietly from the void, and then they saw the bloody people slowly gathering into the blood. At first, Ling Yun didn't take them seriously. He simply felt that these guys couldn't make any big waves. But in the end, after Ling Yun saw this scene, he was stunned for an instant. There was an unbelievable look on his face. At this time, Ling Yun began to panic slightly. Ling Yun subconsciously took a few steps back, and then heard an angry roar coming from his mouth. "Ah, damn it, how dare you do this? How dare you do this? I have to kill you, I have to kill you." At this time, Ling Yun was obviously a bit hysterical, but he couldn't stop those people. One after another, they rushed into the pool of blood. The bloody aura he saw gradually began to become huge. "Stand up!" Ling Yun was instantly panicked. His face turned slightly ugly, and he couldn't help but face back, and began to retreat crazily. At this time, I saw Ling Yun shaking his head crazily one after another. "No, no, you absolutely can't do this, you absolutely can't do this." Ling Yun's face gradually became ugly, and then he let out hysterical shouts one after another, but no one would listen to him to stop him at this time. Ling Yun began to wave his palms one after another towards the ordinary people around him, trying to force these people back. But at this time, Ling Yun had miscalculated after all. Those people were not afraid of Ling Yun at all, because they understood that even if they did not devote themselves to this blood, I am afraid that they would only end up being sucked dry by Ling Yun. The fate of spiritual power. At this moment, the Lord of Guling City stood in the sky, and then he laughed so loudly. The Lord of Guling City seemed to be completely crazy, and his eyes looked at Ling Yun with a cold look. "Ling Yun, now you are certain to die, why don't you just accept death?" At this time, I saw Ling Yun shaking his head crazily. A trace of gloom flashed in his eyes, and then he completely released the murderous aura in his body. "Ha ha ha, I just want to take a look and see who can kill me, Ling Yun. No one in the world who can kill me, Ling Yun, has been born yet." The face of the Lord of Ancient Spirit City condensed, and then he integrated a majestic and vast aura into the palm of his hand. "Really? I will make you pay the price today." Then I saw those people controlled by Ling Yun instantly gathered into the sea of blood, and then they plunged into it one by one without fear of death. Those people were extremely generous and tragic, and the whole person gave people a feeling of desolation. The expressions of those people were indifferent, their faces were gloomy, and there was a sense of desolation between their brows. Almost at that moment, everyone couldn't help but feel a sense of sincere admiration. When Lin Yu saw this scene, he naturally felt quite emotional, and he suddenly stood out. "Add me one more." Lin Yu's voice suddenly came out, and then he saw the eyes of the Lord of Lingcheng and everyone around him, and they instantly fixed on Lin Yu. There was a bit of confusion in their eyes, and there was even more confusion in their eyes when they looked at Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu stood in the air, holding a sword of the Emperor, and the whole person gave people a sense of thick desolation. At this time, Lin Yu still wanted to communicate with the strange beasts in his sea of consciousness, but he didn't know why he couldn't summon anything at this moment. Lin Yu suddenly swung the sword of the Emperor in his hand. Then, they heard a sound of breaking air, and they remembered it spontaneously. Then, they saw a faint sword energy going up to the sky and falling to the earth. A thick and desolate feeling spread out, making everyone look cold. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 833. A gloomy look flashed across Ling Yun's face, and then he heard an angry roar coming from his mouth. Why? Why are you all going against me? In that case, today I will show you what the power of the God King is. As soon as Ling Yun finished speaking, he saw a surging air rising spontaneously in the void, and then he saw that at this moment, streams of blood began to merge into the void from his whole body. Among the statues, waiting for the next second, the blood energy around them forced everyone to freeze. The faces of those people began to turn pale almost at that moment. At this moment, I saw those people looking at each other and looking at Ling Yun in their eyes, full of disbelief. All the people in Guling City hid in their own yards and did not dare to show their faces, because the surging blood really gave them a sense of fear. The people in the city retreated one after another, their expressions full of disbelief. Waiting for the next second, you can see the blood energy gathering around here. Then I saw one of them laughing. That person looked as if he was completely crazy. His expression was filled with a cold look, and a surging murderous intent arose spontaneously. Ha ha ha, today I want to see how powerful you are. I will definitely kill you today. Ling Yun has completely fallen into madness. Lin Yu, who was on the side, seemed to be able to feel how crazy Ling Yun was. Lin Yu got into the imperial sword and swung the sword forward without any reservation. The butcher in the void, the palm of the Lord of Ancient Spirit City, and Lin Yu's sword, they were just trying to shake the Fudo Ming king above the void. At this moment, he saw Fudo Ming dynasty suddenly punching in front of him. After that punch was fired, the surrounding space even felt broken. A surging force instantly merged into one. After a while, the blood-colored murderous aura began to scream, and everyone could not help but start to tremble with it. After a while, the forces collided. Almost in that moment, the entire ancient spirit city completely collapsed in an instant. And the aftermath also drove all the people in the ancient spirit city into pieces. After everyone saw this scene, they couldn't help but become a little silent. Lin Yu was protected by the sword of the emperor, but he was still able to hold on. Looking back, most of the ancient spirit city lord's body had been blown away. As for the butcher, he had already died. At this time, Ling Yun also had a faint trace of blood coming out of him. Blood was all over his body. He didn't know whether it was the enemy's or his own. This battle situation is now extremely tragic. Lin Yu stood there, holding a sword in one hand. At this moment, I saw a faint smile on the corner of Lin Yu's mouth, but the smile was full of bitterness. Ashes return to dust, soil returns to soil, everything will follow. The smoke and clouds of the past will instantly dissipate, and everything should return to peace. A helpless smile appeared at the corner of Lin Yu's mouth, and then he just took a long look. Alas! It's really hard to describe. At this moment, the Lord of Ancient Spirit City also fixed his gaze on Lin Yu. He suddenly flew forward and reached Lin Yu's side, and then his eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. On the body. It's you. Lin Yu looked at the Lord of Ancient Spirit City, his face was a little pale. Listening to the tone of the Lord of Ancient Spirit City, this guy should know him, but Lin Yu couldn't remember where he had seen this guy before. For a moment, Lin Yu's brows knitted together. Then, a faint smile forced itself out of the corner of his mouth. I don't know who you are? Can you tell me? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed directly on the Lord of the Spiritual City. There was a look of confusion in the corners of his eyes and brows, and there was quite a bit of incomprehension between his brows. After hearing Lin Yu's words, the Lord of Guling City couldn't help laughing, and then waved his hand lightly the next second. Ha ha ha, as for me, you don't need to know who I am. After Lin Yu heard what the Lord of Ancient Spirit City said, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead and he was speechless for a while. All right. The Lord of Guling City laughed loudly, and then nodded gently, of course it is true. But you need to tell me who you are. If you don't tell me who it is, why should I tell you who it is? The two people just looked at each other. Ling Yun on the side saw that after the two of them looked like this, they didn't take themselves seriously at all. At this time, Ling Yun was naturally furious. Damn you guys, you actually don't take me seriously, I'm going to kill you. Ling Yun let out an angry roar from his mouth, and his whole face was filled with a cold look, and then he unreservedly displayed the strong murderous aura in his body. The Lord of Guling City and Lin Yu looked at each other, and then shook their heads helplessly. Well, it seems that we have to deal with this guy first before the two of us can sit down and have a lively chat. As for Feng Ling who was standing outside the city, after being invaded by the powerful aftermath, she managed to save her life, but at this time, Feng Ling still had lingering fears. Feng Ling's eyes were full of surprise and confusion. At this time, Feng Ling was breathing heavily, and her face was even more pale. After waiting for a while, Fenlinger reluctantly came back to his senses, and then half closed his eyes the next second. That guy shouldn't die in the city. That guy must not die in the city. If he dies in the city, what will happen to my affairs? At this time, Fenlinger thought of this and suddenly flew directly towards the city. The speed of the wind chime was not slow, and it flew forward and entered the city in almost an instant. But when she arrived in the city, her face instantly turned pale. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji-Sheng Chang. Chapter 834. At this time, Fenlinger saw a scene of corpses everywhere. After Fenlinger saw this scene, his brows seemed to be knitted together, and there was a look of disbelief in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, Fenlinger's expression became slightly, a bit pale. She subconsciously took a few steps back, stumbling, and the mites in the corners of her eyes and brows were filled with disbelief. How is this possible? This is absolutely impossible. How can the scene here be so terrifying? This. Fenlinger was already a little incoherent. She shook her head crazily, unable to believe what she was seeing. Fenlinger slowly walked forward. He could still see a few corpses when he came out, but after walking for a while, he smelled a pungent smell of blood. After she walked forward for a while, the place where ancient Spirit City was originally turned into nothingness. At this time, Fenlinger suddenly flew forward. Her speed was extremely fast because she wanted to see what was going on. At this moment, Ling Yun seemed to feel the breath of the wind chime. The Lord of Guling City and Lin Yu could naturally feel the faint aura of Fenlinger. When Lin Yu felt the aura on Fenlinger's body, his face instantly turned ugly. His expression turned cold, and then he let out a roar. Leave now. But Fenlinger was obviously a few steps slower at this time, because Ling Yun had already appeared behind Fenlinger. At this moment, Ling Yun stretched out his hand and grabbed Fenlinger's neck. At this time, Ling Yun laughed like this, as if he was completely crazy. His eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and a slight sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. Ha ha ha, boy, now your little lover is in my hands. I advise you to just surrender and capture me. Otherwise, if I use just a little force, your little lover will be killed on the spot. Lin Yu's face was extremely ugly. At this time, his expression could not help but flash a bit of gloom. A bit of coldness flashed across Lin Yu's expression, and a strong murderous aura was completely released almost at that moment. I advise you not to play with fire. If you put it away obediently, maybe I can give you a good time later. If not, I will definitely let you know what the price is. Lin Yu's eyes were full of a gloomy look, and the strong murderous aura in his body rushed out almost at that moment. The fierce and domineering aura was completely released from Lin Yu's body in an instant. At this moment, Ling Yun's palm exerted slight force. At this time, he just stared at the corner of Lin Yu's mouth with a smile on his face, and even evoked a somewhat indifferent sneer, with a look of indifference on his face. Boy, I still say the same thing. Now your little lover is in my hands. Don't forget, as long as I exert a little force on my palm, your little lover will die here. Ling Yun laughed loudly, and instantly he seemed to be completely crazy. His eyes when he looked at Lin Yu were filled with a gloomy look. At this time, Fenlinger also knew that she might be doing Lin Yu a disservice this time. A forced smile appeared on the corner of Fenlinger's mouth, and her eyes were full of helplessness. I'm sorry, it's all my fault. I shouldn't have come here. This thing is all my fault. But now that things have come to this, there are all kinds of medicines for sale in the world, but only this regret medicine, there is nowhere to buy it. Lin Yu just waved his hand, and then laughed softly. Ha ha ha, stop being so sentimental here. Don't think about it. Who are you? I have never cared about you. As for your life and death, it has nothing to do with me. Do you understand? Lin Yu's eyes were filled with a kind of coldness as he looked at Fen Ling filled with a kind of indifference. At this moment, after Fen Ling heard what Lin Yu said, her pupils suddenly enlarged, and there was a look of disbelief in the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. Fen Ling's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu. At almost that moment, Fen Ling even spoke a little incoherently. How is it possible? How can you be like this? You didn't say that before, why? Why? At this time, Fen Ling was obviously a little incoherent. Her eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, with a look of indifference on her face. At this moment, Lin Yu was just heartbroken. Hearing Fen Ling's question, he didn't know how to answer for a moment. But at this time, Lin Yu knew very well that the more decisive he was towards Fen Ling the less this guy would care about Fen Ling At this time, Lin Yu just smiled coldly. Don't be so romantic with me here. You don't even know who you are. How can I take you seriously? After waiting for a while, Lin Yu's lips curled up into an indifferent sneer, and a hint of gloom flashed through his expression. Fen Ling's face was ashen. At this moment, Ling Yun's palm was becoming harder and harder. Boy, don't lie to me here. There's something wrong with the way you look at this woman. Do you think I can't see it? You don't have to admit your feelings for this woman, but if I kill her, everything will be fine. Ling Yun also laughed like this at that time. At this time, he seemed to be completely crazy. A trace of contempt flashed in his eyes when he looked at Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with ice, and then he saw the ecliptic, and saw a mean spirit rising from it, and it penetrated Ling Yun's eyebrows almost in that moment. It turned out that when the two of them were talking, Lin Yu had been integrating the aura from his body into the palm of his hand. He was just trying to paralyze Ling Yun. Sure enough, Ling Yun was fooled, so Lin Yu took this guy's life almost in a moment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 835. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly flew forward, and the next second he was in front of Fen Ling A hint of concern flashed in his eyes, and then he directly helped him up. The wind chimes. Ling are you okay? At this time, Fen Ling just pushed Lin Yu away gently, and then slowly walked forward. Didn't you just say that the two of us don't have much to do with each other? Now I don't want to have anything to do with you anymore. From now on, you walk on your Yangguan road and I cross on my single plank bridge. The two of us don't owe me any more. After Fen Ling finished speaking, she walked forward resolutely. At this moment, Lin Yu came directly in front of Fen Lin without saying a word, and then hugged Fen Ling In the end, a bit of helplessness flashed in his eyes. Ling listen to my explanation. This matter is not what you imagined. I just wanted to numb this guy. Think about it, if I didn't say that, how could this guy do it? Let you go. Lin Yu just whispered in Fen Ling's ear. At this time, after Fen Ling heard what Lin Yu said, her gloomy face suddenly became so clear, and then she turned around the next second and stared back with a smile on her face. Lin Yu had a faint smile on his lips. Are you telling the truth? Are you sure you didn't lie to me? After Lin Yu saw Fen Ling like this, 3 black lines suddenly appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. He looked at Fen Ling up and down angrily, and then he said helplessly in a deep voice. So you were lying to me. At this time, Fen Ling just stuck out her tongue playfully, and then waved her hands casually. How can you use deception? You should understand this truth. 3 black lines suddenly appeared on Lin Yu's forehead, and he was speechless for a while. At this moment, after seeing this scene, the Lord of Guling City who was standing by could not help but feel a bit of surprise in his expression. The Lord of Ancient Spirit City stared directly at Lin Yu, and then he sighed softly the next second, and then shook his head helplessly. Alas, this matter. After Lin Yu heard what the Lord of Ancient Spirit City said, a faint smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and then he glanced back and forth at the Lord of Ancient Spirit City. I'm afraid there's nothing to say about this matter, but I think you should always give me an explanation. The face of the Lord of Ancient Spirit City condensed, and then his eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and finally he said softly, "What explanation? How do you want me to explain it to you? Tell me." The two people looked at each other, and the air between them seemed to freeze at that moment. At this time, Lin Yu was gradually approaching the Lord of Ancient Spirit City step by step, and then a faint smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. "There is no special explanation, but I just want to hear and see why you did this in the first place." After hearing what Lin Yu said, the Lord of Guling City couldn't help but let out a long sigh, and then a somewhat indifferent wry smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Alas, this matter is still the same as before. It's hard to explain in one sentence, and it's hard to explain clearly. Then do you want to say it or not?" Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the Lord of Ancient Spirit City. The Lord of Guling City felt helpless after seeing Lin Yu like this. "You'd better go somewhere with me." At this time, the Lord of Ancient Spirit City slowly walked forward with Lin Yu. At this time, Fenlinger had just taken a few steps forward, and then he saw a strong breath, which instantly penetrated Fenlinger's heart. Pillars of blood. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he was stunned for a moment. His pupils suddenly enlarged, and there was an unbelievable look in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, he heard Lin Yu's mouth. With an angry roar, Lin Yu was already a bit hysterical even at that moment. "No." Ling Yun stood up slowly, but his breath was a little weak and he couldn't even stand firmly. Ling Yun's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and then a faint sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. His eyes looked at Lin Yu with a gloomy look. "Boy, although I can't kill you, I can make you live in regret for the rest of your life, ha 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 ha." After seeing this scene, the Lord of Guling City had a bad premonition in his heart. Then the next second, Lin Yu's eyes were red. At this time, without saying a word, the Lord of Ancient Spirit City stepped directly in front of Lin Yu, and then his eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, with a hint of solemnity flashing in his expression. And then he said in a deep voice, "Calm down, you must calm down, you have thought about the consequences of being so impulsive." The Lord of Guling City stared at Lin Yu with his eyes wide open, his eyes and eyebrows full of indifference. At this time, Lin Yu obviously could not hear what the Lord of Guling City said. He just raised a faint sneer at the corner of his mouth, and then pushed the Lord of Guling City away in the next second. At this time, he heard her gnashing her teeth and said, "Get out of the way, you'd better not talk nonsense to me about this matter. There is no room for negotiation. I must make this damn guy pay the price." Lin Yu gritted his teeth and spoke word by word. At this time, the thick murderous aura on his body was almost completely released at that moment. The gloomy and cold breath began to spread a faint turbid air, and it was completely released in an instant, forcing everyone to even feel a little terrified at that moment. Lin Yu's face was full of gloom, and then he just grabbed it casually and saw that thing flying into Lin Yu's palm. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 836. Lin Yu's face was full of gloom, and the rich aura on his body was completely released in an instant. After everyone felt the rich aura, they couldn't help but tremble violently in their hearts. Got up. After seeing this scene, the Lord of Guling City couldn't help but shake his head helplessly. Then a faint bitter smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and there was a clear look of helplessness in the corners of his eyes and brows. "Hey, why do you think you are doing this? You are humiliating yourself, asking for trouble, and in the end you can't even leave a whole corpse. It's sad, deplorable, and even more ridiculous. The face of the Lord of Ancient Spirit City was full of helplessness, and then he did so, narrowed his eyes, and was happy to hear what happened next. At this moment, Lin Yu suddenly flew forward, and then immediately punched him hard from his cuff. That cold breath was completely released almost at that moment, and then the next second I saw you, a faint gloomy air, just like this in an instant, from Lin Yu the cuffs of his sleeves suddenly hit the man's face. Ling Yun's face was shattered in an instant, and blood splattered. At this time, Ling Yun's face began to gradually turn pale. His expression was filled with a kind of indifference, and then his eyes died like this. Staring at Lin Yu, he almost said through gritted teeth, "Boy, if you have the ability, kill me now. I want to see how capable you are." Ling Yun said in a cold voice, gritting his teeth as he spoke every word, and an indifferent murderous aura began to spread from his body so quietly, and a somewhat indifferent sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. After Lin Yu saw the scene at this time, he let out an angry roar, and his face was filled with a kind of coldness. I want to kill you, I must kill you." At this time, Lin Yu was obviously a bit hysterical. Then in the next second, Lin Yu's fist fell on Ling Yun like raindrops. Almost in an instant, Ling Yun's entire body was completely reduced to ashes by Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu was probably a little tired. He collapsed on the ground like this, breathing heavily. His face was slightly pale, and the corners of his mouth were even slightly curled up. A faint wry smile. Why? Why does this guy do this? Why does he do this? Lin Yu turned his head and stared straight at the Lord of Ancient Spirit City. At this moment, Lin Yu's eyes widened with anger, his expression was full of coldness, and there was a strong murderous aura. In an instant, he was like this completely released. At this moment, the Lord of Ancient Spirit City looked at Lin Yu as if he were a wild beast. The face of the Lord of Ancient Spirit City was still a bit pale after all. After waiting for a while, the Lord of Ancient Spirit City couldn't help but sigh softly. A faint bitter smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, and the next second he let out a long sigh. Well, people cannot be resurrected? Of course I understand how you feel. But for this guy right now, you have no other way to eliminate the resentment in your heart except killing him, right? At this time, Lin Yu couldn't help but remain silent for a while. At this time, Lin Yu gently touched his chin, then turned his head and glanced at the Lord of Ancient Spirit City, with a hint of helplessness in his eyes. "Oh, what you said is true, it's just." At this time, the Lord of Ancient Spirit City felt helpless in the corners of his eyes, and then sighed softly. "Oh, there's nothing we can do about it. Many things can't be explained or explained." After waiting for a while, Lin Yu seemed to have remembered something, and his eyes were fixed on the Lord of Linggu City. At this time, the ancient spirit god city lord felt as if he was being targeted by a wild beast. He subconsciously took a few steps back, and finally a faint bitter smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. "Ha ha ha, I just don't know why you are looking at me like that." Lin Yu slowly moved toward the Lord of Ancient Spirit City step by step, and then gently rubbed his chin. "I just think you're funny." After hearing what Lin Yu said, the Lord of Ancient Spirit City couldn't help but feel a bit of confusion flashing through his expression, and then his brows seemed to be knitted together. "I'm funny? I don't seem to understand what you said." After a moment, he saw Lin Yu and just waved his hand gently. "Forget it, it's pointless to continue arguing about this matter. This guy should disappear." After Lin Yu finished speaking, he just lightly snapped his fingers. Then the next second, Ling Yun was completely stood up by the sword of the emperor. Ling Yun's mouth screamed like a slaughtering pig one after another, and then the next second, Ling Yun's entire aura weakened in an instant. Then, Ling Yun was blown into a ball of blood mist. A faint smell of blood drifted out. When the Lord of Guling City saw the scene from afar, he couldn't help but tighten his mouth, nose, eyes, and eyebrows, and there was an unbelievable look in his eyes when he looked at Lin Yu. This. At this moment, Lin Yu suddenly smiled. He just turned his head slowly, and then in the next second, he stared at the Lord of Guling City with a smile on his face. Any problem? After a moment of silence, the Lord of Guling City shook his head. No problem, maybe this kind of guy should be treated appropriately. After the Lord of Guling City finished speaking, he flew forward and took the lead. For some reason, even though the entire city of Guling was destroyed, the mayor of Guling City did not show any sadness on his face, as if Guling City had nothing to do with him. Lin Yu just thought that the mayor of Guling City was a little strange. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 837. At this time, Lin Yu followed the two masters of Ancient Spirit City and marched forward for a long time, and then they came to a vast desert. The Lord of Ancient Spirit City pointed in the direction of the desert, and then a helpless smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. His face began to turn pale, and then he said helplessly. According to legend, this endless desert is a magic weapon, a treasure left by the God of creation. It is said that the God created us, and it is said that the magic weapon contains the secret technique that can resurrect people. After Lin Yu heard what the Lord of Ancient Spirit City said, he just felt that the Lord of Ancient Spirit City was a little strange. He looked at the Lord of Ancient Spirit City with a smile on his face, and then coughed lightly. The corner of his mouth also evoked a faint smile. Although I have to admit that your story is very interesting, I still feel that your story doesn't move me at all. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the Lord of Ancient Spirit City, and then he spoke leisurely. The Lord of Guling City heard Lin Yu and was slightly stunned at first after he finished speaking. Waiting for the next second, he couldn't help but feel dumb for a while. This story is indeed interesting, but it is not the story I want to tell you. After Lin Yu heard what the Lord of Ancient Spirit City said, a bit of confusion flashed across his expression, and then the next second, his eyes were fixed on the ancient on the body of the Lord of Ling Cheng. Then what do you want to tell me? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the Lord of Ancient Spirit City, his whole expression was full of confusion, and then he spoke unhurriedly. The Lord of Ancient Spirit City just took a deep breath, and then calmed down his mood slightly. Actually, what I want to tell you is that the person killed by that guy may be able to be resurrected after you get that artifact. Of course, according to legend, that artifact is connected to the gate of another world. The gate of another world, after opening, it will be full of suffering. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what the Lord of Ancient Spirit City said, his pupils suddenly enlarged, and his eyes were full of surprise. At this time, his eyes were staring straight at that feeling was on the Lord of Ling Cheng. What? What did you say? That ghost place in front actually leads to this other world. Are you telling the truth? At this time, Lin Yu's voice even trembled slightly. His eyes were staring straight at the Lord of the Spirit City, and then there was a sense of disbelief in the corners of his eyes and brows. Look. After seeing Lin Yu's confusion, the Lord of Guling City thought this guy was a little weird, but he still nodded subconsciously the next second. What you said is indeed true. It does lead to a different world, so what do you want to say? At this moment, Lin Yu began to understand why he got involved in this ghost place. The Lord of Ancient Spirit City stared straight at Lin Yu, with complete myopia in the corners of his eyes and brows, a look of confusion. Lin Yu just smiled slightly at this moment, and then waved his hands gently the next second, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Nothing, I said I decided to go and see what kind of place it is in the legend that can open the door to this other world. Lin Yu stared at the Lord of Ancient Spirit City with a smile on his face, and a faint smile naturally appeared at the corner of his mouth. The Lord of Ancient Spirit City just felt that Lin Yu was a little strange. At this time, the Lord of Ancient Spirit City fixed his eyes on Lin Yu. He looked up and down at Lin Yu, but he did not find anything. Clues. A moment later, the Lord of Ancient Spirit City nodded his head gently, and then smiled softly. Well, I did covet your imperial sword before, but after what happened this time, I finally understand that this imperial sword will live in its owner, so I am not qualified to compete with you. I apologize to you for what I did before. At this time, the Lord of Guling City spoke softly. After Lin Yu heard what the Lord of Ancient Spirit City said, his pupils suddenly enlarged, and then he turned his head, staring straight at the Lord of Ancient Spirit City, looking at Ancient Spirit City. The eyes of the city lord were full of disbelief. Lin Yu couldn't believe what the Lord of Ancient Spirit City said was true. At this time, after the Lord of Guling City heard what Lin Yu said, a faint smile appeared on the corners of his mouth, and there was a hint of amusement in the corners of his eyes and brows. What? It seems like you don't believe my apology to you. After Lin Yu pondered for a moment, he nodded gently, I really don't believe that you can actually say such a thing. The two people just looked at each other and smiled. At this time, a hint of helplessness flashed in the eyes of the Ancient Spirit City Lord, and after a moment, he turned around. Based on the current situation, it seems it's time for me to leave. After Lin Yu saw the Guling City Lord like this, a bit of confusion flashed in his eyes, and then he looked at the Guling City Lord. Now that Guling City has been destroyed, where are you going to go? The Guling City Lord chuckled, and then said slowly and softly. This world is so big, I can find a place to stay anywhere, what do you think? After Lin Yu heard what the Guling City Lord said, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless in his heart. At this time, he just coughed lightly. Ahem, but aren't you afraid that you will lose your place to stay in this world? The Guling City Lord just waved his hand, and then shook his head. Of course not, I believe my luck is not that bad. After the Guling City Lord finished speaking, he disappeared in front of Lin Yu in the next second. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's expression was filled with indifference. Then he shook his head helplessly and slowly walked away. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 838. At this time, Lin Yu looked at the endless desert in front of him, and his whole heart could not help but tremble slightly. At this time, he didn't know why, but he felt as if something was calling him in the depths of the desert. Lin Yu half closed his eyes, and then gently rubbed his chin. It's strange, it's really strange. I don't know why I always feel like there is something, as if it is calling me in the dark. What on earth is that thing? What on earth is that thing? At this time, Lin Yu was even a little incoherent. At this time, Lin Yu recalled that something seemed to be affecting him before this. At this time, Lin Yu really didn't know where he should go for a moment, but a moment later, Lin Yu at this time still walked like this, actually walking slowly towards the front. The sky was filled with yellow sand all around, and Lin Yu suddenly became aware of the faint aura around him, which began to gather towards him bit by bit. Originally, Lin Yu thought that he would have to walk in this ghost place for a long time before he could feel the rich aura. But what Lin Yu never expected was that he would be able to sense the rich aura after just walking for a while. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes were full of joy, and the smile at the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious. Lin Yu slowly took a few steps forward, and then in the next second, he just felt a wave of indifference, rushing toward his face. The yellow sand in the sky turned into a beam of light and stabbed straight towards Lin Yu's chest. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's face instantly became ugly. He suddenly flew back and retreated continuously for a long time before finally standing still. Stabilized his body. Then he saw a huge dark cloud covering his head in an instant. After Lin Yu saw this scene, his face suddenly became increasingly ugly. He subconsciously pulled back, took a few steps back, and then felt a calm aura. At this time, Lin Yu's hands formed a showy and complex curse seal. I don't know why, but at this moment I saw those distant and vast auras, which began to spread quietly in the void almost at that moment. A strong energy came from the void, and then it shot out into the sky like a mighty force. That majestic aura caused everyone to be forced to retreat crazily back one after another at that moment. Almost at that moment, the ethereal aura condensed into one. In the blink of an eye, an air of indifference rushed over him in an instant. Then in the next second, he saw that not far away, the sand had condensed into a huge human-faced elephant. After Lin Yu saw this scene, a faint sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth, and then he seemed to have seen everything through, and finally shook his head. I didn't expect that you would finally be willing to show up." Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at him, the giant statue in front of him, and then he shook his head, with a faint sneer at the corner of his mouth. At this time, after seeing Lin Yu like this, the giant statue didn't appear too surprised. He just glanced back and forth at Lin Yu, and then said in a deep voice, "To be honest, you look exactly as I imagined. You really didn't show any surprise or panic. As the saying goes, the mountain is collapsing, and maybe it's you who doesn't move." After Lin Yu heard what the giant statue said, the corner of his mouth couldn't help but evoke a faint smile, and then he couldn't help but wave his hands so gently. "Ha ha ha, you're rewarded, but now I want to know clearly, what is the purpose of taking me with you so much?" Lin Yu slowly raised his head, and then his eyes were fixed directly on the giant statue. A bit of confusion flashed across the corners of his eyes and brows, and the corners of his mouth curled up even more. A faint smile. After the giant elephant heard what Lin Yu said, something strange flashed across his face, and then the next second, he couldn't help but snorted. "Humph, little guy, I am going to give you a great opportunity, but it seems that you are not happy at all, but why?" The giant statue's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and then it said in a deep voice. At this time, Lin Yu just pondered for a moment, and then a faint smile appeared from the corner of his mouth. There was quite a bit of playfulness in the corners of his eyes and brows, and then he continued so unhurriedly. Said, "Perhaps it's because there are no big surprises, but there is no need to say more about this matter. Today I just want to know, what is your real purpose?" Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the giant elephant, and then he spoke softly and unhurriedly. After hearing Lin Yu's words, the giant elephant just pondered for a moment, and then shook its head and smiled. "The reason for this is naturally very simple. I just want to play a game with you. Of course, this game still requires some bets." At this time, after Lin Yu heard what the giant statue said, his whole expression could not help but condense, and then a bit of confusion flashed in his eyes in the next second. "Some bets? What do you want to bet on? Tell me." Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the giant elephant, with a bit of confusion in his expression. The corner of the giant statue's mouth also evoked a bit of amusement, and then he coughed lightly, and then said so leisurely, "It's actually very simple, but it's just to block your body." The giant elephant said in a deep voice. "You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment." Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji-Sheng Chang. Chapter 839. As soon as the giant elephant finished speaking, Lin Yu understood what the purpose of this concrete image was. At this time, Lin Yu couldn't help but laugh like this, and he seemed to be completely crazy. His eyes were fixed on the giant elephant, and then he said in a cold voice like gritting his teeth. "I understand, I finally understand what your purpose is. That's it, that's it?" At this time, after hearing Lin Yu's laughter, the giant statue couldn't help but flash a bit of indifference in its expression, and then its eyes stared straight at Lin Yu, With the corners of its eyes and eyebrows a faint gloom flashed through it. What? What is my purpose? Tell me. But it's just because he deliberately wants to take her away from me. What I said must be right. A trace of gloom flashed across Lin Yu's expression, his brows were full of coldness, and a strong murderous aura was released almost completely at that moment. Cold meaning. At this time, the giant elephant heard Lin Yu. After finishing what he said, he couldn't help but laugh loudly, and then his expression was full of indifference. Ha ha ha, what you said is indeed true, and I did have this purpose, but unfortunately you may know it too late. At this time, Lin Yu just shook his head, and then his expression was completely indifferent, and then he said almost as if he was gritting his teeth. Do you think I will agree to you? I have never done this kind of loss-making business, so I want to tell you that I am sorry to tell you that you have been planning for so long, and I am afraid you are going to make a mistake. The sneer at the corner of Lin Yu's mouth began to become more and more obvious, and then his whole expression was filled with a kind of indifference. At this moment, after hearing what Lin Yu said, the giant elephant did not feel angry at all. Instead, he just coughed lightly, and then spoke leisurely. Ahem, you can't say that, how do you know you won't agree? At this time, the giant elephant seemed to be confident. At this time, Lin Yu half squinted his eyes, staring at the giant elephant. He didn't know why he suddenly had a somewhat ominous premonition in his heart. After Lin Yu saw this scene, his face couldn't help but become so cold, and his expression became condensed. What exactly do you want to do? After the giant statue heard what Lin Yu said, he couldn't help but start laughing crazily. The cold air from his body completely came out almost at that moment. Ha ha ha, don't forget that young girl, but she died because of you. If you really can't bear to see her and die like this, of course you don't have to make this bet with me. At this time, Lin Yu felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave after hearing what the giant statue said. At this time, he suddenly had a bad premonition in his heart. Lin Yu's fists clenched and his body clenched. That bit of murderous intent was completely released almost at that moment. Damn it, you bastard are threatening me, right? When Colossus heard what Lin Yu said, he couldn't help but laugh loudly, and then waved his hands casually, his expression completely filled with a kind of indifference. You can understand it this way, and I won't make any excuses. Now I can give you a stick of incense to consider whether you want to agree to me or let that girl die forever. After Lin Yu saw this scene, his whole expression couldn't help but become so condensed, and then there was a cold murderous aura in the corners of his eyes and brows. Waiting for the next second, he gritted his teeth like this, and then sneered like this, ha ha ha, okay, this time you are cruel, it seems that I have no choice but to agree to you, isn't it? The Colossus didn't seem to expect that Lin Yu would agree to him so happily. It was slightly stunned at first, and then waved it casually the next second. Then Lin Yu saw the scene around him suddenly change, and almost immediately after that, he felt as if he was in the middle of this world, at the end of time for all things. Lin Yu felt that there was not a trace of light in it, and everywhere he looked was nothingness. At this moment, Lin Yu's face began to look slightly pale. He took a deep breath and then forcibly calmed down his mood. What on earth are you going to do? What on earth do you want me to do for you? At this time, Lin Yu was almost hysterical. His face was filled with a pale color. At this time, he was shouting at the top of his lungs. But at this moment, he heard the voice, which sounded faintly and coldly in Lin Yu's ears, and then he heard a prehistoric sound, as if coming from far and near from ancient times. Little guy, all you have to do is get out of this, and you win. If you can't get out, you will fall into endless sinking, and your divine body will belong to me. At this time, Lin Yu saw that he was surrounded by a well of emptiness. His face was slightly pale, and a bit of indifference flashed across his expression, and a sense of coldness arose spontaneously. Lin Yu's face was also frozen at that time, and his expression was full of gloom, and the monstrous murderous aura was completely released from Lin Yu. If you ask me to go out, I will definitely make you look good. At this moment, no matter how Lin Yu shouted, the voice seemed to sink into the sea and no one responded. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's eyes and eyebrows were full of coldness, and then he couldn't help but sigh. Alas, it's hard to say, but it's really true that things in this world are impermanent. At this time, Lin Yu could only wave his hand helplessly, and then he began to look around. But in this endless nothingness, there is no concept of time and space at all, even the power of law is vague. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji-Sheng Chang. Chapter 840. At this time, Lin Yu seemed to be in an endless state of despair. His entire complexion gradually became ugly. At this time, he saw Lin Yu gently rubbing his chin. No, if this place is really the end of the world and the end of time and space, then there will never be any law power in this place. So the law power is just a trace, but it is still clearly captured by Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu just rubbed his chin, and the faint smile on the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. At this time, his eyes flashed with a bit of playfulness. Interesting, I figured it out. At this time, Lin Yu just said in a deep voice, and then in the next second, he calmed down and concentrated his mind. A strong aura emanated from Lin Yu's body. Then he saw that around here, the law power was slowly drifting towards Lin Yu bit by bit. At this moment, Lin Yu's eyes showed a little more joy, and then he heard a roar from his mouth. Condition for me. As soon as Lin Yu finished speaking, he saw countless laws of power around him, and almost at that moment, they began to surround Lin Yu frantically from all directions. At this time, Lin Yu only felt the traces of laws of power on his body, which were condensed into lines almost at that moment. Then he saw Lin Yu suddenly waved his hand in front of him, and then he saw that he suddenly had more laws of silk threads in his hand. Lin Yu gently stroked his chin, and a faint sneer appeared on the corner of his mouth. Then he heard him say in a deep voice, "The 3 realms and 6 paths obey my orders. After 1,000 turns, they are just a drop in the ocean. Condensate." As soon as Lin Yu finished speaking, he saw the laws one after another in the vicinity, and the threads almost completely condensed into one in that instant. Then he saw a gurgling of indifference in the vicinity, and the vigorous power instantly became so ethereal. Almost in this breath, but in that virtual moment, the powerful power around him instantly gathered together, and everyone felt this power at this moment, and their expressions couldn't help but condense. After seeing this scene, everyone's eyes and eyebrows were full of an unbelievable look. At this time, Lin Yu just stood with his hands behind his back. At this time, a faint solemnity flashed across his face. Strange, this power seems a little strange. And at this moment, a faint voice suddenly sounded in his mind. That faint voice made everyone's mind condense at this moment. A touch of great spirit condensed out. Waiting for the next second, the group of distant and vast meanings instantly began to spread from Lin Yu's body, little by little. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly opened his eyes, and then he sighed lightly. Alas, the mountains and rivers are safe, the grass and trees are without support, but that's all, that's all. After Lin Yu finished speaking, his hands quickly formed a curse seal at that moment. In the next second, the vast air rushed straight into the sky. After everyone felt the ethereal air, their hearts and minds were calmed. After a moment, Lin Yu's expression turned cold, and then he gently waved his hand in front of him. A sharp air instantly emanated from Lin Yu's palm. The sharp air exploded completely in an instant. At this time, Lin Yu's expression was full of indifference, and the ethereal air began to emanate quietly. Lin Yu looked down from a high position, and his eyes and eyebrows were full of indifference. I understand, I understand. At this time, Lin Yu's voice was slightly low, and his eyes were full of a kind of hot expression. The coldness in the expression was gradually obvious. At this moment, the distant and ethereal air in the surroundings completely gathered in front of Lin Yu's chest. At this moment, a sword suddenly broke free from Lin Yu's body. But at this time, there was no surprise in Lin Yu's eyes. A faint smile appeared on the corner of Lin Yu's mouth, and then he heard him say coldly, "I knew it was you." At this moment, the Emperor's sword seemed to understand what Lin Yu was saying, and the next second he turned into a human form. After the Emperor's sword turned into a human form, it looked like an old man. After Lin Yu saw the old man, a faint gloomy expression flashed across his face, and then he suddenly stepped forward and a strong air came out. "Why do you want to plot against me?" The strong air completely enveloped the old man. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the old man couldn't help but laugh loudly. The next second, he gently flicked his sleeves, and then said in a cold voice, "Ha ha ha, you don't know the reason for this." 3 black lines appeared on Lin Yu's forehead, and he was speechless for a while. He glanced back and forth at the sword of the Emperor angrily, and then said directly and coldly, "How could I know? Don't forget, you are plotting against me." Lin Yu's face gradually became ugly, and the murderous aura in him completely exploded almost at that moment. After seeing this scene, the Emperor's sword couldn't help laughing. Almost at that moment, his whole aura began to burst out. "Ha ha ha, it's ridiculous, it's really ridiculous. I didn't expect you didn't know the reason for this. This really surprised me." At this time, Lin Yu just rolled his eyes.